Traders, how are you? With Marcello. Today we're doing the recap of what happened in the markets last week. This week we have a lot of movement in regards to the collapse of the dollar, where we have a lot of countries that are starting to direct trade with their own currency rather than using the US dollar. And we even have a situation with places like England, for example, where people are starting to eat not rotten food, but expired food and taking less medicine to be able to save money with all the exploding inflation. Let's get started. The Fed's preferred inflation report did show cooler than expected increase in prices, which is a good thing. But we do have other countries like Germany and England that are still seeing quite an explosion in the cost of things when it comes to inflation. Overall, the markets in the US super positive, all over 3%. Canada was just under 3%. Markets in the Euro area mostly positive as well. Those went up 3, 4, 5%. Latin America mostly positive, with the Merval hitting over 12%. In the Middle East and Africa, mostly positive as well. Egypt was over 5, being the biggest positive of all. And then looking at the numbers here, when it comes to Asia and Australia, most were positive, between 2 3% as well. So good news for the week. It looks like the banking crisis is officially over now that First Republic Bank, or Citizens Bank, excuse me, I'll give you the name here in a second, officially accepted to take on the Silicon Valley Bank assets. I'll give you the details of that in just a moment. Before we do that, Bitcoin and other crypto news. U.S. federal judge temporarily stopped the sale of the bankrupt Voyager Digital that was going to be sold to Binance for $1.3 billion. They said that it's going to allow them more time to pursue an appeal to the legality of the deal. Binance is in its own problems as well. The CFTC is suing Binance because they supposedly had some violations when it comes to governing the commodities markets. CFTC, if you didn't know, is the SEC covers more securities and equities and things like that for stocks, and the CFTC is more things like derivatives and futures and that kind of thing, commodities. Elon Musk, or because of the actual lawsuit now that CFTC is filing against Binance, investors pulled out $1.6 billion out of Binance. The war against crypto in the United States is kind of turning up a notch. Elon Musk is asking a federal judge to throw out a lawsuit for $258 billion that has to do with racketeering and his supposedly his support of the pyramid scheme of Dogecoin. Investors accuse that they deliberately drove up the price of Dogecoin 36,000% in 2 years and just to let it crash. Most of the Bitcoin now, not Bitcoin, but most of the cryptos now, we're seeing a lot of them with just kind of pump and dump schemes. Bitcoin overall is higher this week, 3.59%. It hit just under 28,000, even though it's still kind of bouncing around from when I took the number. It is the best performing asset so far in 2023, over 71% positive for the year, but it is still negative, just over 38% year over year. In commodities, Britons are now starting to save food by eating expired food, or eating food after the expiration date, I should say, and also starting to take less medicine. What are the pharmacy companies going to do? All these pharmaceutical companies are going to make their billions now. German supermarket prices are skyrocketing as the food inflation hits a record 22.3% in March alone. And Nigeria, if you guys were looking forward to what's coming with the New World Order in 2030, Nigeria is the first country to introduce the CBDCs, or what I very passionately call government coin. They're if you see this video, you're going to see in just a moment, they're issuing fresh water with an RFID tag. So if you eat too much meat or you travel outside of a space you're not supposed to go, you're not going to be able to have any water, fresh water, that is. Cargo theft, led by food and beverages, is surging across the United States. It's going up by 600%. Since more and more people are having a hard time paying their bills, they're going out and stealing what they need to be able to sell it. Last year, the Euro countries sought to put an end to the dependence of Russian energy supplies and impose sanctions on Russia. If you guys remember, we had a huge surge in oil prices, with initially was a huge boom for Russia, but now supposedly they're going to start to see the effect in the Russian economy. The de-dollarization of the dollar as well is starting to take note in places like India, where Russia, instead of selling their oil and nat gas to places like the West and Europe, they switched to quote unquote friendlier countries like China and India, and the imports from Russia to India in oil jumped by 22-fold. The energy revenue accounted for 42% of Russia's federal budget in 2022. And supposedly now, according to the West, especially the Western media, and supposedly now they're going to start seeing a decrease in those revenues. From the OECD is saying that they're going to decrease by 5.6% and 3.3% according to the World Bank, which I don't know if I necessarily believe, because remember, Ukraine was winning the war, if you guys remember that. Oil prices have fallen for the fifth consecutive month. U.S. crude went up by over 9% to 75.67. Brent went up by over 6.5% to 79.89. Gold went down by 0.43% to 1970. And silver is up over 4% to 24.31. Now that we have this expectation that they may not be increasing the interest rates as much or at all in the second part of 2023, we're starting to get a lot of movement there in the oil and silver markets. Finance and banking news. The German consumer prices are rising by more than anticipated in February. They went up by 9.3%, with a lot of the inflation in the euro area as a whole exceeding the average of what they were expecting in the previous months. First Citizens Bank was the bank that I was telling you guys that officially bought the assets of Silicon Valley Bank. Remember that Silicon Valley was the largest bank failure since 2008 and the second largest overall in the history of the United States. They're going to assume the assets of $110 billion, $56 billion in loans, and $72 billion worth of, $110 billion in assets, $56 billion in deposits, and $72 billion in loans. SVB, which was the bank that collapsed, was the 16th largest bank in the U.S. at the end of 2022. The years of the reserve status for the U.S. dollar might be coming to an end. I find it very weird that all of this is kind of happening all at once. Even the mainstream news like CNN and Fox News were talking about what would happen in the case of a collapse of a dollar. Since the U.S. has abused or weaponized the U.S. dollars against countries that it doesn't like, now we're starting to see a lot of countries choose to use other currencies instead of the U.S. dollar. Now, if you didn't know, the system that we have in place kind of in the world is called the petrodollar. The reason why is because there was an agreement between Saudi Arabia and the United States, which kind of created a culture that basically you just needed dollars for everything, because Saudi Arabia only sold their oil in dollars, which is starting to change as well. So everybody before, what they did was they went out and they bought dollars to be able to go ahead and buy the oil and then other things, mostly commodities in the open market. Now we have a situation where we have BRICS countries, for example, that are talking about launching their own currency. And now we have a lot of countries that are doing bilateral trade in their own currencies rather than the US dollar. So what's going to happen? There's going to be less of a demand for the dollar overseas. A lot of those dollars are going to come back home to the U.S. And if you didn't know, there's actually a lot more dollars outside of the U.S. than in the U.S. So as those dollars start coming back home, what happens when you have a lot of something? The product value goes down. That in terms of a currency means inflation, because the value of the dollar is going to go down. And eventually we're going to hit the hyperinflation, which is what Venezuela and places like Argentina have. Now, BRICS overall account for 31.5% of the global economy. So now the countries of the BRICS like Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have a bigger portion of the global economy than any of the G7 nations, which is kind of the old school people that used to rule the world, let's say. they only have 30%, the G7, compared to 31.5% for the BRICS. And it's expected with the enlargement of the BRICS nations, they're going to start adding more countries. They're going to account for 50% of the global GDP by 2030. So, changing of the guard. France, which is part of the G7 and supposedly a friend of the United States, even bought 65,000 tons of natural gas from China in yuan, not in euros, not in dollars, but in yuan. Now, as people want to get rid of the US dollar as well, keep in mind that 40% of the stocks owned in the United States are owned by foreigners. 1/3 of corporate bonds, right? Companies, these corporations that issue debt, 1/3 of corporate bonds are issued by foreigners, or owned by foreigners, I should say. And 1/3 of the government bonds are owned by foreigners as well, which is about $8 trillion. So if all of a sudden people don't want dollars anymore and they start selling everything, imagine 40% of the people in the stock market selling their stocks because they don't want dollars, or companies that issue dollars. Big problem. U.S. consumer spending rose moderately in February at 0.2%. Following the largest increase in nearly 2 years in January. Political news: Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu fired his defense minister Gallant, triggering mass protests as Gallant kind of broke with the, let's call it kind of the government, let's call it, in Israel. And he talked about how if they do overhaul the judicial system, it's going to be an immediate and tangible threat of security of the state. So there's mass protests because the government fired him because he spoke out against the government, basically. Because remember, the government is never on your side. Donald Trump has been indicted by the Manhattan grand jury after a controversial probe into the supposed hush money for the porn star Stormy Daniels. He is now becoming the first former U.S. president to face criminal charges. And remember, I always do these videos, try to do apolitically, whether you're on the right or on the left. I just report the news, give you my reaction. So that's what happened. Don't be too crazy there in the comments. Strikes started in Germany over the exploding inflation. If you guys remember, there were some pretty serious riots and protests in France as well. I literally just saw in the news that they set the tax department on fire in France. And the protests in Germany were the biggest walkout in decades, affecting mass transit and airports as well. In corporate news, Intel went up by over 7% as the company had a new investor event focused on the data center business, as well as the chip-related announcements. H&M, which is the big clothing chain, went up by over 16% after the operating profit went up in Q1. Surprisingly, they've been doing a lot of cost cutting, which has helped a lot so far. You can see it in the numbers since they had that profit in Q1. Shares of Tesla rose over 6% in the conference call that they had about their Q4 earnings, not earnings, but earnings. They talked about how their production, the demand was still 2 times the rate of the production that they had, which means that they're going to continue to have good numbers here on out. And Alibaba, which is the technological giant out of China, is going to go through its biggest restructuring in the last 24-year history. They're splitting into 6 different units and exploring fundraising and listings for most of them, now that the Chinese government is supporting private industry instead of their crackdowns that they had for the regulatories starting in late 2020. In trade news, South Korea, which is 4th largest economy in Asia, saw a fall in their March year-over-year export numbers. That's significant because South Korea is one of the largest exporters in the world. So if their exports are going down, it means that the economy isn't doing as well because people aren't buying their stuff. 4 artificial intelligence experts expressed concern after their work was cited in an open letter co-signed by Elon Musk, demanding that they pause their research. They want to have a 6-month pause to be able to find out what's going on. So, so the robots don't kill us, obviously. And the Chinese search giant Baidu, which is the Google of China, launched their own AI as well called the Ernie Bot. They were going to have an open public event, which they decided to do privately because they had so many companies that wanted to test out the Ernie Bot. In international events, Turkey's parliament approved a bill on Thursday to accept Finland to join NATO, which is not going to be good for how Russia feels about that because they're right on the border. And Tunisia is cutting off the water for 7 hours a night due to the worst drought that they've had for the 4th year in a row now. The agricultural minister is saying that they're setting up a quota system for potable water, in addition to banning the use of agricultural water until September 3rd. In unusual facts this week, according to scientists at a brain lab in the Australian National University, more magnesium in the diet can lead to better health. Right now, dementia is the second leading cause of death in Australia, the 7th leading cause of death in the world. And they're saying that magnesium-rich foods like spinach and nuts can help reduce the risk of dementia. And an amateur gold digger in Australia found a $160,000 rock that had a lot of gold in it. It had over 10 pounds or almost 5 kilos of rock, called the Lucky Strike Nugget. That's the news for this week, guys. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Don't forget to subscribe. And don't forget, the preppers were right.